Namashriyati Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarapaya Swamini Taparine. We make a salutation to that great sage and seer Vivekananda, Prince among monks. Salutation to the embodiment of Sat Chit Ananda and also remover of all sorrows. So today we are celebrating the birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda, and it's very difficult, given the time, to encapsulate the life of such a remarkable person in a few words, so we won't try and do it. We'll try and highlight a few things. And because I'm not a speaker but a bookworm, then all I'll do is select some passages from Romain Rolland's wonderful biography of Swami Vivekananda. He published 2 volumes. One was on the life of Ramakrishna, and the other one was on Swami Vivekananda, volume 2. I have it in front of me, so we'll select some passages from there. But firstly, a few ideas. So the shloka that we have just chanted is significant because we are saluting what? A sage and a seer. And there was an earlier question, Vivekananda, was he an avatara? And I was explaining that his master is deemed by some to be an avatara. Why I say by some? By devotees. And by Vivekananda himself, who registered it like that. But Vivekananda, of course, will give us a whole range. Vivekananda will tell us that life is like a huge ocean. We are all waves within it. And from time to time, from age to age, a giant wave comes, displacing many others. And a few smaller waves may come from time to time and leave their mark, remarkable waves called prophets. And these remarkable personalities leave their mark and enduring mark and serve to support all of the giant waves that come. And what's the difference between those and us? We have to push our wave up, as it were, and make our own mark. We arrive in a state of ignorance, and we strive for knowledge. That's the whole purpose of what we're doing. We're looking for knowledge. Now, doesn't mean to say attending university, doesn't mean to say reading books. That's not the kind of knowledge we're talking about. The kind of knowledge we're talking about is deep knowledge of a superior kind, what the Upanishads call paravidya, as opposed to aparavidya. Even study of scripture is relegated to this aparavidya, because it is all within the phenomenal category. And the phenomena, the things that we know of and know about, things which come and go, things which are within a spatial, temporal area, these are all the objective world. But the subjective world, that is the ground of all being, the support of all being, the inner entity that never wavers. Earlier on, we gave a meditation indicating this. I asked people to visualize a mountain, and the characteristic of that mountain is it doesn't move, and yet it has a great strength. But all analogies are imperfect, and a great question arises: if everything in this world is just matter and material, insentient, how do we get conscious beings running around, talking, analyzing, laughing, crying, exhibiting, investigations, making a curiosity about things called science, wanting to know the how and the why and the wherefore, and thinking and rationalizing and deciding and reacting? So that's an interesting question. Modern terminology for it is called the hard question of consciousness. How do you get from unconscious matter to conscious living being, to teenagers chewing gum. How do you get all of that? So the answer that Vedanta supplies, not just as a theory, but as a practice, that you can stabilize yourself and enter into that supreme area, and that supreme area is stable. There are no waves within it. All the other things have waves. This has no waves. It is like that lamp in a windless place, says the Bhagavad Gita. Or it is that consciousness, ajna, that never flickers. It is unborn, ajna, unborn, whose consciousness is not bent or flickering or changing. And that's your own nature, and it's not a nothing, because we can easily dismiss it as a nothing because our familiar world isn't like that. But of course, it is the highest area of bliss. And this prayer that we have just repeated tells us Vivekananda was an ancient sage, reborn. Now, it's common kind of misunderstanding to think history supplies us with saints and sages. It's okay 2,000 years ago, but today is different. There's no hope for us in that way today. We live in a busy world with traffic and M50s and, difficulties, domestic, political, national, etc. And so we live busy lives. We live technologically busy lives. And so really, yes, it may have been okay in the past, but we live in a real world. That's the expression. In reality is the expression. It's all very well you guys talking about meditation and talking about the inner Atman and the spirit and all of these things and God and karma and all of these philosophical and theological things. But that's all pie in the sky because we live in a real world, and this world has physical pain, this world has emotional pain, and we have elation, and we have disappointments, and we have death. Well, apart from it being a highly negative point of view, that is not really the reality, and that's the fundamental point that all the Vedanta sages tell us, that you're looking at it in the wrong way. What we see is just an interpretation of something which is subtle, and that subtle thing we call Brahman. And Brahman, when seemingly manifested, as it were, just as when the sun's light manifests as 9 kinds of waves in the visible spectrum, we think there is a red, we think there is this color and that color, but actually it is only this one white light that seems to be split up into all these dimensions and more that we cannot see. When we forget it, from age to age, great waves come along and tell us, no, they put us in the right direction. You have made the wrong interpretation. Take your attention and guide it towards what religion calls God. And there's nothing wrong with religion. The difficulty is in the priests. The difficulty is in the Sadducees. And these are not my words. Swami Vivekananda stated this, and it's his birthday today, so that is why we are enthused to explore this remarkable sage that we call Vivekananda. His very monastic name tells the story. He who has the bliss of spiritual discernment. But you see, Romain Rolland has gathered information, and he writes this remarkable book, probably the earliest biography. And I could have chosen 2 sources. One would be this Romain Rolland's source, and the other would have been The Master as I Saw Him by Sister Nivedita. Both would be extremely valid. Sister Nivedita's book really gives an intimate portrayal of Swami Vivekananda, the way he thinks. Now, when we say the way he thinks, it means the way he tunes in to the infinite cosmic mind and comes out with unique, inspirational, revolutionary positions. And Romain Rolland, just to tell you about a little bit about him, he lived from 1866 to 1944, and he was a French man of letters and received a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1915. And his works include Jean Christophe and Pacifist Manifestos collected in a second novel, various novels. He's a prolific writer, not only of novels, but historical and philosophical plays. And so he has written biographies. Now, one biography is a biography of Beethoven. He wrote that in 1903. And we can see in the prelude to his book on Swami Vivekananda how enthused he is with Swami Vivekananda in comparing him with Beethoven. Now, those who know me will also know I'm a big fan of Beethoven for one reason, many reasons actually. Apart from the fact that he was a revolutionary composer, he had no false pretenses. And he understood his uniqueness. And furthermore, he went through life in a stormy way, and yet underneath it, he found God. And that comes out in his music. So Romain Rolland has this to say. He says that, talking about how Swami Vivekananda would speak, he compares he says his words are great music phrases, he says, in the style of Beethoven, stirring rhythms like the march of Handel choruses. He says, I cannot touch these sayings of his, scattered as they are through the pages of books at 30 years' distance, without receiving a thrill through my body like an electric shock. And what shocks, what transports must have been produced when in burning words they issued from the lips of the hero. And even, of course, in his prelude, he has a few things to say. I'll read them out. Firstly, he starts off the great disciple whose task it was to take up the spiritual heritage of Ramakrishna and disseminate the grain of his thought throughout the world, was both physically and morally his direct antithesis. He says the seraphic master had spent his whole life at the feet of the divine beloved, the Mother, the living God. And we should pause just to reflect a little bit on that, because in saying those things, it brings us to the subject of how we understand this question of knowledge, what we mean by knowledge. What we mean by knowledge is our own direct experience. And if we haven't got that exactly, if we haven't, if we're shown some sample of the way, we are shown by those who have had that direct experience. Swami Vivekananda, from very young, when he fell asleep, he saw a bright light in between his eyebrows. And this light accompanied his sleep, and he thought everybody saw it. And he was astonished to know that it wasn't everybody's experience. It was his own subjective experience. We understand from his master, Sri Ramakrishna, that he had a vision of the quality and essence of Swami Vivekananda. He had a vision of a small boy, and there were the 7 traditional sages seated in heaven. And one is there, and he's tugging, hey, come down with me. And it's well understood that the little boy was Ramakrishna, and the sage was Vivekananda, Naran. So we see Vivekananda being completely inspired, even though he had all the right background and so on, a person of heroic temperament from the very young, just like Beethoven, by the way, in the midst of hearing loss, being able to compose such stirring melodies, fighting all the way, and using his malfunction to make the point. In this same way, with such bold temperament, Vivekananda, throughout his biographical life, we see these heroic traits where he stands up. And for this reason, strength is the highest value of all. Anyway, if we continue with this prelude, this seraphic master had spent his whole life like that. He had been dedicated to the mother from infancy. Before he had attained self-consciousness, he had the consciousness that he loved her. And although in order to rejoin her, he had been condemned to years of torment, that was only after the manner of a knight-errant, the sole object of those trials, of whose trials was to make him worthy of the object of his chaste and religious love, he says. She alone was at the end of all the interlacing paths in the forest. Now we have to understand that Naran fought tooth and nail against Ramakrishna's mother Kali. He couldn't believe in it. He, like many young people who were of the intellectual bent, joined the Brahmo Samaj, thinking that this was devoid of superstition, the right way. And so they had a formless aspect of the Supreme. So when Ramakrishna interviews these young men, one of the first questions he asks is, do you believe in God with form or without? At the beginning of what we now know as the Gospel of Ramakrishna, the author, Mahendranath, who wrote carefully all the conversations, was astonished at this confrontation, as it were. It put him off balance. He thought, how can God have form and be formless? He said, well, I like to think of God without form. Yes, good, that is good, says Ramakrishna. But don't forget, he also has form. And this is the great, great theme, not just a theory, not just some speculation, but this is his own experience. It is this experience that we rely on for a model for our own life. Anyway, he goes on. She alone, the multiple God among the thousands of faces, and when he had reached her, he found that he had learned to recognize all those other faces and to love them in her, so that with her he embraced the whole world. The rest of his life had been spent in the serene fullness of this cosmic joy, whose revelation Beethoven and Schiller have sung for the West. That's his first mention of Beethoven. And of course, if you're puzzled by these two names, well, certainly we've heard of Beethoven, but Schiller had a composition which came out as the Ode to Joy, and that came out in the Ninth Symphony, arguably Beethoven's not only most astonishing and greatest work, greatest symphony, but always was referred to as the symphony by classical musicians. There was none other that could exceed it. And I'm sure you all know this Ode to Joy, because when the Berlin Wall fell, everybody sang it. And every occasion, everybody seems to sing it.
It's the European anthem, isn't it?
I think so, something like that.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's a Eurovision Song Contest.
Yeah. Anyway, he had realized it more fully than our tragic heroes. Joy appeared to Beethoven, mentions the second time, only as a gleam of blue through the chaos of conflicting clouds. Romain Rolland writes beautifully. While the Paramahansa, that is Ramakrishna, the Indian swan, rested his great white wings on the sapphire lake of eternity, beyond the veil of tumultuous days. Now, his greatest disciple, of course, was Naran, this Vivekananda. And Vivekananda could only attain his heights by sudden flights amidst tempests, which remind me, says Romain Rolland, over and over again of Beethoven. Even in moments of rest upon its bosom, The sails of his ship were filled with every wind that blew. Earthly cries, the sufferings of the ages, fluttered around him like a flight of famished gulls. Now, when we look at Vivekananda, of course, typically we see photographs of him in meditation, deep, deep meditation. And we also see him seated in various postures and so on. And some people might not understand the nature of his activity and his passion from these photographs, from these pictures. Sitting serenely, posing for the photographer, difficult to understand that inside there is a very torrent of feelings. And this is what mobilizes him. When he goes the length and breadth of India, he comes to the conclusion that God is in the suffering, in the poor, in the afflicted. He is bold enough to tell straight away his fellow monks, his fellow Gurubhais, all devotees of Ramakrishna, I don't know much about your God, but if there's no God seen in the suffering and the poor and so on and so forth, then I don't see, I'm paraphrasing, much point in all of this. So the earthly cries, the sufferings of the ages, fluttered round him like a flight of famished gulls, says Romain Rolland. Passions of strength, never of weakness, were striving within his lion's heart. He was energy personified, and action was his message to men. Even when he returns to India after going to the West, being sponsored there, he returns after, let's say, about 3 years, and his message, triumphal message to India is, enough of this, religion that you have and so on. Be men, stand up. It's the same message that Krishna gives to Arjuna. And he's inspired by various experiences in the West. He's inspired by the dedication to social service. He's inspired by the fact that women have education. He's inspired by the democracy. On his second visit to America, he sees through it a little bit and sees that it's all to do with money and greed. But still, these particular aspects of the West he takes on. So the passions of strength is never of weakness. And so for him, again, as for Beethoven, it was the root of all the virtues. I teach only one message, he says, and that is of the Upanishads. And of that I teach one virtue, and that is strength. So strength equates to spiritual virtue. On the other hand, weakness equates to ignorance. Ignorance equates to suffering. And whether it is physical suffering, whether it is mental suffering. And he goes with his message to the West, with his countrymen in his heart, thinking that there's a worthwhile exchange that can take place. The deep, timeless spirituality of India as the panacea of universal diseases, so to speak, he brings to the West in exchange for the pragmatism, the materialism, the technology that the West has to offer, the values essentially of equality, social justice, and things like that. Concern for the social conditions of the country. He brings that to India. That seems to be a worthwhile exchange. And if we look back in history, we see only one example of this, and that is Buddha. Buddha sending missionaries off 2 by 2 into the Western countries. And then about 500 years later, we see the same thing. We see St. Paul being inspired on the road to Damascus by the Christ, which he had never met as a historical personality. But his whole life got transformed with this theophany. And shapes and develops Christ's message throughout the West. And again, mixing spirituality with material reality of the day, so that 300 years later or so, the religion that was persecuted, that was condemned and ridiculed, became the national religion of the Empire of Rome. And I see Swami Vivekananda's message to the West as this universal message. It is not about preaching the personality of his master. He avoided that. Maybe to a select few, such as at Thousand Island Park or something, he would talk about his master. But otherwise he left it because he didn't want to make a sect. His message was universal. He only taught Vedanta. Why? Because that is the universal message. We are members of the Dublin City Interfaith Forum, and our greatest contribution is to tell all these diverse religions, 7 different religions, we deem you all to be true. All your paths are true. And we see that some thinking people are saying the same thing in this modern age. How can you not say it? And Vivekananda says it boldly. And that's a bridge too far for many religions. They want to hold on to their exclusiveness. And Vivekananda says, woe to that day. This word mlecha in Hinduism is a terrible thing. Because any religion, be it Hindu, Christian, what have you, that closes itself off, fences itself off, and denies entry to those not on the same wavelength, as it were, or holding the same views. That's not universal religion. That's sectarianism. We all have to be careful about this, because see how Swami Vivekananda would have been so enthused with the personality of the Master. He, in his view, there is no body, no incarnation compares with his divine master. And yet, he restrains himself from telling this because he doesn't want to make this personality cult. We'll see this later on. And so, for him, as for Beethoven, it was the root of all the virtues, this strength. And he went so far in his aversion to passivity, whose secular yoke weighs so heavily on the patient bovine brow of the East, as to say, above all, be strong, be manly. I have a respect even for one who is wicked, so long as he is manly and strong, for his strength will make him someday give up his wickedness, or even give up all work for selfish ends, and will then eventually bring him into the truth. This was written in a letter in 1891 by Swami Vivekananda to his Alwa disciples in Rajputana. In terms of how he looked, when we study a personality, we all want to know, but how did he look? And I don't think photos do him justice. He was, we know, approximately 170 pounds, at like 77 kgs. He stood at 5'8.5" His posture, with arms folded, makes him look a little taller than that. Actually, Ramakrishna, who looked smaller, was was more like 5'10", something like that. Forgive me for talking in those measurements. I'm metric sometimes and imperial other times. And his jaw was more Tartar than Hindu. Vivekananda boasted of his Tartar ancestors, and he loved to say that the Tartar is the wine of the race. He was a square-shouldered, broad-chested, stout, rather heavily built. His arms were muscular and trained to all kinds of sports. He had an olive complexion, a full face, vast forehead, strong jaw, a pair of magnificent eyes, large, dark, and rather prominent, And of course, this we see in photos. He had heavy lids whose shape recalled the classic comparison to a lotus petal. Nothing escaped the magic of his glance. He was capable of equally of embracing in its irresistible charm, or of sparkling with wit, irony, or kindness, of losing itself in ecstasy, or of plunging imperiously to the very depths of consciousness and of withering with its fury. But his preeminent characteristic was kingliness. That's why we call him Raja. He was a born king, and nobody ever came near him, either in India or America, without paying homage to his majesty. So when this quite a young man as he was in his 30-odd year, he appears in Chicago at the inaugural meeting of the Parliament of Religions that was opened, as we know, 11 September 1893 by Cardinal Gibbons. All his fellow members were forgotten in his commanding presence. His strength and beauty, the grace and dignity of his bearing, the dark light of his eyes, his imposing appearance, and from the moment he began to speak, the splendid music of his rich, deep voice enthralled the vast audience of American Anglo-Saxons previously prejudiced against him on account of his color. And we can add that when he spoke, I think he spoke in something like a Scottish kind of accent, because that's who he studied under in India, a Scotsman. Now, we have some additional information. He had a beautiful voice like a violoncello. This comes from Josephine MacLeod, his devotee. Grave without violent contrasts, but with deep vibrations that filled both hall and hearts. Once his audience was held, he could make it sink to an intense piano, piercing his hearers to the soul. And Emma Calvé, a great opera singer, who knew him, described it as an admirable baritone, having the vibrations of a Chinese gong. So we get some idea now of the physical presence. But what does a physical presence mean? It is the manifestation, it is the automatic echo of the inner personality of the person. And we can see how his light shines. Now, Krishna's message was universal. His message was profound. His message was a message from the well of his own experience, and portrayed to those he trusted, to those who were pure enough to absorb his message and for them to develop their own spirituality. But he always put Narayan as the leader, and that was always acknowledged. And so we can see that even from very young, he had his whole birth was because of prayers to Shiva. And if you go to his ancestral home in Kolkata, you'll see the Shivaling that was worshipped there. So it was in vain, says Romain Rolland, continuing in his prelude, that Vivekananda refused to accept any homage, judging himself severely and humiliating himself. Everybody recognized in him at sight the leader, the anointed of God. It's remarkable that he was a teacher, of course, and he had disciples, but it is remarkable that they all thought of him as more like a brother. They thought of him, he was very intimate with them. He never posed as a guru, and always invited a challenge, always invited a discussion, never insisted that people accept everything that he said. except in terms of his vision, because he had a very clear vision in which he established the Ramakrishna order, the whole movement like that. And he had this clear universal vision of an organization that would continue spreading Vedanta. That's the primary mission. That's the salvific mission for every person. That's why we're here as a Vedanta society, not to promote any personalities or make a religious cult or a church, but to say something that appeals underneath everything. And we use this also with people of all kinds of persuasions and faiths, even that of atheism, where we say something that rings true. And it's not what we are saying. It's what is the truth of these great rishis, these great sages. So it was as if his chosen God had imprinted his name upon his forehead. He was a traveler who crossed his path in the Himalayas without knowing who he was, stopped in amazement and cried, Shiva. And this was related by Dhan Gopal Mukherjee. So we've got some basic idea. His wanderings we will bypass, but we know that all his wanderings had the effect of touching his heart. The day when Narayan comes in contact with suffering and misery, the pride of his character will melt into a mood of infinite compassion, said his master. His strong faith in himself will be an instrument to re-establish in discouraged souls the confidence and faith they have lost. And the freedom of his conduct, based on mighty self-mastery, will shine brightly in the eyes of others as a manifestation of the true liberty of the ego. This is a quotation from the work of Sharadananda, Divya Bhava, and all this, of course, is gathered from these various sources by Romain Rolland. So the misery that he came across in India, the hopelessness of a people who had no education, who were desperate for food. So his policy was food first, the body first, and then the mind. And the synthesis of spirit achieved the promise of Ramakrishna's message of love. The unseen master presided over all their meetings that he had, and they were able to place their intellectual labors at the service of his universal heart. Now we have a very useful comments from Romain Rolland, which explore the universality of things, and I'll read this out as well. This is in this panorama of all the heroic and divine thoughts of humanity, we must again notice the place of honor which seems to have been given to Christ and the Gospels. These Hindu monks kept Good Friday and they sang the canticles of St. Francis. Narayan spoke to them of the Christian saints, the founders of the Western orders. The Imitation of Christ was their bedside book, together with the Bhagavad Gita. Nevertheless, there was never for a moment any question of enrolling themselves with the Church of Christ. They were and remained complete and uncompromising Vedantic Advaitins. And they incorporated in their faith all the faiths of the world. The waters of Jordan mingled with their Ganga. If any Westerner waxes indignant at the abuse he sees in this connection, we would ask him whether the mingling of the waters of the Tiber with the river of Palestine is any better. It must be clearly understood that though the disciples of Ramakrishna, the Master, had a great veneration for the Christ. He for them was always one of the many prophets and incarnations, and at no time did he predominate in their thought over the great Hindu incarnations. I had a dialogue with a Christian priest of the Syrian Orthodox persuasion, South Indian Orthodox, and I told him about this universality that we hold. And he said, yes, he said, but what about Jesus talking about, I am the way, I am the gate, you can only come to the Father through me, and so on. And I said, it's a question of interpretation, because we believe it's true from the point of view of the prelude, the Logos statement at the beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word. And I went through that passage and I said, so the uniqueness of Christ as a historical entity or as a manifestation of the Word. If you take the latter, we fully agree. And he thought about that, and I saw him nodding. Now, whether he agreed or not, or just being polite, I don't know. But the point is, supposing our universal message is that we can harmonize everything at the very, very fundamental oceanic level, the underneath, where we all agree, where all mystics go, where all mystics drink, where there is only oneness, like the deep depths of an ocean. Would it not be a better world? And I think you'll find it will. Now, I want to say a little bit of something about his preaching in America. His motto was tolerance, religious universalism. The 3 years of travel in the New World, the perpetual contact with the thought and faith of the West, had ripened his idea of a universal religion. But in return, his Hindu intelligence had received a shock. He felt the necessity for a complete and thorough reorganization of the great religious and philosophical thought of India, if it was to recover its conquering force and power to advance and penetrate and fertilize the West, a view he had already stated in what was then Madras in 1893. As the time has come for the propagation of the faith, he says, the Hinduism of the rishis must become dynamic. After having concentrated on itself for centuries, it must come out of itself. So its jungle of ideas and interlaced forms required to be put in order, and its great systems classified around several stable pivots of the universal spirit. On the one hand, he had managed to couch the Vedantic language in a scientific framework. He had managed to give his message in such a way that the Western world, particularly in America, would understand it on their terms. And it wasn't just a random thing. America was ripe for it. It had thoughts from Thoreau and Emerson and various others, Waldo and so on, all of that. There was a refreshed way of thinking that prepared the ground for the message of the Vedanta in America. And when he went to England, he found that it was a little bit more solid there. They were more serious about it. So his early attempts at spreading this deep message of Vedanta found its fruit in small groups, ultimately, small intimate groups. It's worthy to note that 60% of Swami Vivekananda's disciples were all Westerners. And we see these great saintly people. We see, for example, Sister Christine. We see Ole Bull. We see Josephine MacLeod. All giantesses in their own right. And of course, our own Sister Nivedita. In fact, we know very little about Swami Vivekananda except for Sister Nivedita. she was so close to him. And I think it's fair to say that on his demise, she became the voice of Vivekananda. She had that same undercurrent of national pride in India, realizing the deep spiritual message of India was really the message for the whole world. So, in the jungle of ideas in India, that's the other side of it, he managed to systematize this jungle, systematizing these things that were already there in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, of these 4 yogas, and harmonizing all of that, and making sure that despite all the different expressions that we call Hinduism, which is not a single religion, but a league of ideas, a league of religions, but conforming to some central things. That is the orthodoxy of believing in the authority of the Vedas, for example, and the systematic expression of spiritual life contained in the compatible echoes of the dimensions of the mind coming out as systems. Bhakti yoga, the yoga of expressing your feelings, stirring it in a devotional way, love of God. The idea of karma yoga, dedicating all your activities to the divine, systematically doing all your activities without any stress. The idea of meditation at its deepest level. Raja Yoga being, in my view anyway, a very, very foundational book. And furthermore, this dimension of the mind, the intellect itself, that wants to pierce through all things and investigate, but with a view to investigating what is permanent and unchanging amidst all these changing things. So, the apparently contradictory conceptions in Indian metaphysics, the absolute unity of non-dualism, Advaitism, qualified unity and duality, which clashed even in the Upanishads. The Upanishads have these 3 approaches, these commentaries, characterized by Madhva, Ramanuja, and Shankaracharya. They needed all to be reconciled, and the bridge built joining them to the conception of Western metaphysics by the establishment of a table of comparison destined to set forth all the points of relationship between the profound views of the oldest Himalayan philosophy and the principles admitted by modern science. Make a whole unified system from the whole of this that contradicts nothing, that acts as a plus. We agree with you, but let's go further. Like Ramakrishna's story of the woodcutter who goes into the forest. Let's go further, go deeper, go deeper. And the deeper you go, the more revealed treasure you find. He himself wished to write the maximum testamentum, the universal gospel, and he urged his Indian disciples to help him in the choice of the necessary materials for this construction. He was very adamant. He says, "It is a man-making religion that we want. It is a man-making education all round that we want. It is man-making theories that we want. And here is the test of truth. Anything that makes you weak physically, intellectually, and spiritually, reject as poison. There is no life in it. It cannot be true. Truth is strengthening. Truth is purity. Truth is all knowledge. Truth must be strengthening, must be enlightening, must be invigorating. Give up these weakening mysticisms and be strong. The greatest truths are the simplest things in the world, simple as your own existence." And so he had a plan when he went to India, a plan of campaign, like a military campaign. He had it. And so much for his return. to India. In teaching, he wrote, of course, a magnificent letter which was inspired by the spectacle of the noble social philanthropy of America. And it ends on a note of hope, which shows that he who could scourge the tartuffes of the Christian faith felt more than any other the breath of amor caritas, that is love, love of the heart. Animating this same faith in its sincerity, he writes, I am here amongst the children of the Son of Mary, and the Lord Jesus will help me. That is from the life of Swami Vivekananda. So no, he was never the man to trouble about religious barriers. He was to utter this great truth. It is well to be born into a church, but it's terrible to die there. To the scandalized outcries of bigots, Christian or Hindu, who felt themselves called upon to guard the closed doors of their exclusive faiths, so that no infidel might enter, he replied, I don't care whether they are Hindus or Muslims or Christians, but those that love the Lord will always command my service. Plunge into the fire, my children. Everything will come to you if you only have faith. Let each one of us pray day and night for the downtrodden millions in India. And we might say, now that we know, all over the world now, we extend it, who are held fast by poverty, priestcraft, and tyranny. Pray day and night for them. I am no metaphysician, he writes, no philosopher, nay, no saint. I am poor, I love the poor. Who feels in India for the 200 millions of men, is now of course 1 billion, and women sunken forever in poverty and ignorance? Where is the way out? Who will bring the light to them? Let these people be your God. Him I call a Mahatman, a great soul whose heart bleeds for the poor. So long as the millions live in hunger and ignorance, I hold every man a traitor, who, having been educated at their expense, pays not the least heed to them. And so he never forgot, for a single day, the primary idea of his mission, the same whose talents had gripped him as he traveled across India during his wandering days from the north to the south, from the south to the north, between the Himalayas and the Kanyakumari, to save his people, body and soul, the body first, bread first, mobilize the whole world to help him in his task by widening his appeal until he became the cause of the people, the cause of the poor and the oppressed of the whole world. So that was this complex person called Swami Vivekananda, who really is very much like Beethoven in the sense that he had this temperament, this heroic temperament, and he expressed himself instinctively by tuning in to the flow of divine wisdom and expressing it in such a unique way. A unique orator, having never spoken before, see how he becomes an orator at the part of the religions. A person who is an intimate teacher, a person whose heart is mobilized by the condition and suffering of others, be they psychological or physical. A person who is not afraid to go where angels fear to tread. A person who has uniqueness and ingenuity, where he gets his ideas from. Sister Nivedita, traveling with him on the boat, where she has this inspiration of writing his biography, The Master as I Saw Him, is struck by wonder at the flow of process of his thoughts, maybe pacing up and down on a deck, and how he's expressing thoughts about history, thoughts about people, thoughts about philosophy, thoughts about the future, thoughts about his mission, thoughts about subtle philosophical points, and all of these coming out in the most ingenious way. So let us see, without Ramakrishna, there's no Swami Vivekananda. This great giant wave arrives that we call Ramakrishna. But who knows him? Everybody knows Vivekananda. Very few know Ramakrishna. This is how Vivekananda understood it. Too precious, really. He said, understand my master as you wish. Take him as a saint or an incarnation or whatever you like. The idea of putting the personality to mar the message was not in his mind. That doesn't make it universal anymore. And the universal message continues for all of us by living the philosophy of the Vedanta, the deep, deep philosophy of the realization of your own divine self. That's universal. Everything else is superfluous. Everything else is probably not universal. The way we manifest it is not universal. And repeatedly we summarize it through his words that each soul is potentially divine. The goal for all of us, the goal is to manifest this. And we can do it through the mind, essentially, controlling nature, internal and external, and the various dimensions of the mind that he describes as philosophy or work or worship or the concentration, one or more of these and be free, that kind of thing. But then going on, very, very emphatically, to understand that on the surface, the expressive surface, where we want to individually, because of our individual constitution, express ourselves as with books and temples and churches and rituals and dogmas and doctrines. They are secondary details. They are like a structure that we require, in his words. It is good to be born in a church, it is well to be born in a church, but not to die there. Once we have done with the structure, we can do away with it, and sometimes we don't really even need the structure. So the central message, and he was the best messenger for it, the outstanding Vivekananda, a light of the world, who was able to put into words and universal language, understanding the sentiment of the people he was talking to, be they in India, in Eastern culture, or be they in America, in Western culture. He managed to bring the message home to everybody, tailored for them, and became the mouthpiece, the expressive expansion of the fundamental realizations and teachings of his master. Wherever there is a great descent, that is avatara, wherever a cosmic balancing power comes in and intervenes, as it were, like a giant wave, then we find these messengers that broadcast that message. In the case of Christianity, it is St. Paul, St. Peter, and so on, the apostles. But principally St. Paul. In Buddhism, we see it as the missionary endeavor that goes out. We see it in Ashoka, for example, that goes out to foreign lands and never destroys what is there, preserves what is there, but puts the Buddhism on the top of it. We see it in all these ways, and so Swami Vivekananda was the light of the world, but bringing the light, not his own, but that of his master. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Swami.
Good Swamiji.